The summit talks between US President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping started a short while ago. And to talk about the key issues more in detail, I'm joined in the studio by the Director for Chinese Studies at the Sejong Institute, Dr. Seong-hyon. Welcome. And to my left is our very own business correspondent, Kim Hyesung. So, Hyesung, let's start with you first. So, who else is at this very high-stakes meeting, and what are some of the key sticking points here?
As President Trump and Xi and U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, U.S. Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin, and Chinese Vice Premier Liu He are present at the meeting. But as for these trade talks, it's more than just reducing U.S. trade surplus deficit against China, which is at $420 billion in 2018. Over the past months, the two have made progress on services, currency, agriculture, and non-tariff barriers to trade. It seems like they were close to reaching a deal until President Trump accused Beijing of backtracking on previous agreements in May. The sticking points right now are over how to enforce U.S. intellectual property protection, prevent forced tech transfers, and U.S. demands on China to make structural changes like cutting subsidies for its state-owned companies. For China, it doesn't want those changes written into law, saying it would undermine its sovereignty. It also wants the U.S. to remove tariffs on Chinese imports. Trump did tell reporters in Osaka Friday that he expects a productive discussion with Xi, but the differences between the two sides are big. It's more like a tech war over who will dominate future high-tech industries. Take a listen to what President Trump said at his G20 opening speech on Friday.
Trade, we must also ensure the resilience and security of our 5G networks. This is essential to our shared safety and prosperity. Further, the United States opposes data localization and policies.
Well, thank you, Hyesung, for bringing us up to speed. Well, earlier this week, US Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin actually projected a bit of optimism, saying that a trade deal was 90% complete. But then Mr. Trump came out and said that he is willing to impose extra tariffs if things go wrong. So my question to you, Director, is whether you see a conclusive deal coming out of this meeting.
Well, I think I completely agree with Hyesung that it is not just about trade. It is more than that. And I think now the issue is becoming an issue of credibility and trust, because what Hyesung just mentioned about intellectual property rights, cyber theft, but how the issue is how U.S. can trust China to implement these measures. So U.S. is asking China to change the law, but change the laws means that it touches upon the national sovereignty issues. For example, the reform of SOE, state-owned enterprises, provides money to Chinese Communist Party, and asking the reform of Chinese state-owned enterprises is like cutting off your arm and dying, bleeding to die. So it's very hard for Chinese to honor the U.S. request. So it's going to be a long-term ordeal, and I think there are three possibilities. One is divorce. Second is shaking their hands together, smiling at the camera, and walk away. The three, and say that, oh, we agreed to resume our negotiations. The third is a modest compromise. Anything is possible because Trump is unpredictable.
Well, the rest of the world has also been affected by this almost year-long trade dispute, and that's especially true here in South Korea. South Korea has been walking on eggshells, trying to balance the demands of its top security ally, the United States, as well as the demands of its top trade partner, China. So my next question to you, Hyesung, is what the impact has been on the world economy as well as South Korean businesses.
Right, so far the two sides have imposed tariffs on a total of $360 billion worth of goods one another. So it does affect U.S. and Chinese consumers who are hit by higher prices. But it's more than that, because the two are the biggest economies in the world, so it affects global supply chains, hurting production and lowering investment. For a figure, the IMF said current and threatened U.S.-China trade tariffs could cut global GDP for the next year by 0.5% or $455 billion. That's a loss larger than G20 member South Africa's annual economic output. The IMF says South Korea, with exports accounting for half of its GDP, is the most vulnerable to the trade war, followed by Germany and Japan. In fact, South Korea's exports have fallen for 7 straight months amid slowing global trade, and a report by the Korea International Trade Association says U.S. tariffs on China could lower South Korea's exports by 0.14%. But then again, it's not just trade. President Trump's blacklisting of Chinese tech firm Huawei also creates a tricky situation for local Korean companies like Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix, which export chips to Huawei. So I know you are an expert on this, Dr. Lee, who just came back from a tour of Huawei headquarters in Shenzhen, China yesterday. So what was the mood like in China, and how is this trade spat really affecting Korean companies?
Well, first of all, Huawei is a really big place. It's half the size of Yeouido, one district in Seoul, and it has more than 100 buildings. It has a lake, it has towers, it has castles, almost like castles. So, I think by talking to the people, executives there, my impression is that, one, they think that the U.S. attack on Huawei is politically motivated. I'm saying this as a Chinese side argument. The second is that while they placing their hope that the G20 summit will deliver Huawei from their ordeal, current ordeal, but then they also at the same time preparing for long-haul struggle, this tech war that you just mentioned, so that they think that even though Huawei will struggle for the next 2 or 3 years, but then it will technologically innovate. It has artificial intelligence lab that employs 400 PhDs around the globe, and they are catching up. And also they make good products that will make consumers choose Huawei. You know, whatever political claims there might be, if Huawei will be able to produce good product, then it will be at the end of the day, consumers will stay with Huawei. I think that's their strategy, so that Huawei is ready for long-term struggle for this U.S.-China trade war. It is not just a trade war, as you mentioned, but it's more like a part of a bigger competition for global leadership, as we experts will see.
How does it affect Korean companies then, like Korean chip makers that ship to Huawei? Because U.S. blacklisting of Huawei also affects Korea, right?
So Trump will come to Seoul, and he will meet some of the major South Korean company executives. This is the first time the U.S. president will have such kind of meetings. And I think the number one concern already is that what if Trump mentions about Huawei and pressure South Korean companies? Even if he doesn't say it's a pressure, but I think they feel the heat to avoid Huawei. But then Huawei has already very close relationship with the South Korean companies. And also, we cannot just choose one over the other, US over China or China over United States. So this is a very difficult time for South Korea, where we have very close relationship with both countries. South Korea's, China and the United States takes 40% of South Korea's entire global export. So South Korea will buckle up, will face some very difficult time. One of the Singaporean friend that I just also came back from Southeast Asia asked, what is your strategy in your case? That's that countries, small countries like South Korea and Singapore, other countries, sometimes there is no way out. You just have to be ready for take some beatings from big countries. Maybe that is a solution when you don't have a solution.
Well, since the trade dispute, businesses not only in China and America, but around the world have been suffering from the impact, and they've had to rethink their supply chains, production lines, and even their long-term business strategies. And so the question is, even with a deal between Trump and Xi, will things ever be the same? What does it look like in the future? It's already
not the same. Many people say when the crisis will come. I tell them we are already in the middle of a crisis. So they say when it will end. We just started. I tell them it just started. So I think we should not be naive about this, even though politicians say, oh, the global cooperation. Of course, we want to see the global cooperation between the two companies, two big giants. But then we also face the reality. And what is very likely scenario is that bipolarity in the future, as countries will be forced to choose between US and China, and there is one pole that is a US-centered pole that countries will side with the United States. The other pole group is countries will side with China, particularly many Southeast Asian countries. So that, but for South Korea, because we have very good and robust and important relations with both China and the United States. So South Korea is very vulnerable in this situation. So that I think this is a time for wisdom, for what we should tide over this crisis that we are facing.
I see, but even with a deal, many say that beneath the surface of this trade war, the two economic giants are actually engaged in a power struggle. And of course, President Xi has his Made in China 2025 vision, and President Trump has promised to make America great again, and he's also looking to his 2020 elections. So between these two polar opposite ideologies, is a compromise even possible? Can there be a positive-sum game?
I think you already answered the question. That is, it's increasingly becoming impossible and difficult to compromise because Trump wants to make America great. Xi Jinping wants to great rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation by year 2050. So both sides cannot back down, and there's also domestic audience they're waiting for and cheering up. You should not back down. Even China is suffering for this time. When I go to China, they think that our leaders should not back down. This is a great heroic struggle. So at the first, it was more about trade imbalance. It was about import and export, but it is increasingly becoming a power struggle between the two great powers. So I think probably South Korea also should be ready for long-term preparations to tide over this kind of challenges that is unprecedented in South Korea's history for the last 1 century.
I see. Well, the US-China conflict is set to hit its one-year mark in exactly 1 week from now. So a deal today would be very significant indeed. Well, that's where we'll have to leave the discussion for now. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining the programme.